All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Great to see a lot of folks here joining us for today's Green Living Seminar presentation. This is the 2025 series focusing on rewilding our world, and these presentations take place on Wednesdays at 5:30 here in the MCLA Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here. And if you'd like to see the schedule of upcoming presentations or access recordings from prior presentations, you can go to our website at www.mcla.edu/greenliving, one word. Before I turn it over to today's presenter, I would like to just let you know that next week is spring break. So we won't be here. Don't come back next week, but do come back the following week on Wednesday, March 26th. Paula Peters, Communications and Programs Coordinator with Native Land Conservancy, will present a lecture titled Land Protection from the Indigenous Perspective. Today's presentation, titled Land Conservation for Wildlife in Western Massachusetts, will be given by Andrew Madden. He's the Western District Supervisor with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Thanks so much.
I think we're live here on the microphone. Yes, thank you very much, Elena. Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks everybody for having me here and for coming out tonight. It's nice to be part of this seminar series, which is a really great series. I enjoyed watching some of the earlier speakers. I hope to find some time to catch the rest of them once you're finished up. But I'm going to be talking about land conservation for wildlife in Western Massachusetts, and I'm going to try to keep it pretty local in my conversation here. A lot of the things I'll talk about, the strategies and techniques for land conservation, apply statewide and even beyond the state of Massachusetts. But I'll try to bring it back locally wherever I can. Those of us who are in conservation in this area, and I've been doing conservation of one sort or another for 20 plus years in the Berkshires, we're really fortunate to work in this area because we have so many great partnerships. You know, we have local land trusts and regional land trusts and national conservation organizations and statewide conservation organizations and many different state and federal agencies all working towards land conservation and recognizing the importance of land conservation, working towards some of those common goals. So what you're going to hear from me tonight is just one perspective, one agency's perspective. We at Mass Wildlife are the agency that has statutory responsibility for fish and wildlife resources in Massachusetts. But just keep in mind that this is one aspect of land conservation, and there's a lot of other people doing work along the same lines. So first, very quickly, tell you who Mass Wildlife is. We're the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, which is a division of the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game. And so, as I mentioned, we have statutory responsibility for fish and wildlife resources in Massachusetts. And that includes restoration, protection, and management of freshwater fish and wildlife, including rare and endangered species. We also manage, restore, and protect land for the public to use, which is a really important part of our mission. But kind of simply put, what we do is ensure the biodiversity of the Commonwealth is protected in perpetuity. That's our mission. Did I get that right? There we go. So some of our agency priorities. We manage the fish and wildlife populations in Massachusetts. We also emphasize landscape scale conservation, which I'll talk a little bit about. Climate resiliency and biodiversity are priorities for us, as well as habitat management and land protection, which is what I'll be talking about here tonight. We also promote outdoor recreation and engaging the public on issues of wildlife conservation. So our land program really weaves throughout all those priorities, and it's a major way we accomplish all of those things. So the goals of our program for land protection is to protect ecosystems that contain significant fish and wildlife resources. So that might mean rare and endangered species, it might be unusual natural communities or uncommon natural communities, it could be large landscapes or large blocks of land, or sometimes even smaller pieces which might have significance for connecting larger landscape blocks. And so all of that feeds into the second part of that goal, which is conserving biological diversity and providing public access to lands and waters in the state. So here's how I'll structure our presentation tonight. I'll talk a little bit about why land conservation matters, a little bit about the history and funding within our agency on how we conserve land, the types of land conservation that we do, how we decide what to protect, because that's a really important part of it. How do we know what we want to protect, what's important for us from a wildlife conservation standpoint? And then the responsibility of stewardship and management that comes along with protected lands and public lands. I'll talk a little bit about where we are and then what's coming in the future, hopefully. So why does land protection matter for wildlife? Well, in order to have biodiversity, we need habitat for those animals to survive and thrive. And so that means we need representative habitats that cover a variety of ecological community types. And we need that at a scale that can meet all the life history components of a particular species. So the size of these conservation projects really matter. And Massachusetts is one of the most densely populated states in the country. I think you probably all know that. I think we might be third on the list of most densely populated state in the country. And so what we have is a lot of fragmented habitat, a lot of pieces of conservation land that are not always connected. And so our open spaces really are important in a state like this. And when we think about our natural systems, right, they offer vital ecological benefits, right? They filter our air and give us clean water and provide us with food and economy and recreational opportunities. So protecting those natural areas, it really helps ensure that life, meaning plants, animals, people, can thrive. And to give you a scope of some of the concerns we have wildlife-wise, the Massachusetts State Wildlife Action Plan lists 570 species of greatest conservation need. So these are species that are recognized as vulnerable or in need of conservation actions. And you can see from this list, it covers a variety of taxa, most taxa actually. It has things like mammals that range from, shrews up to moose, or birds that range from tiny warblers all the way through bald eagles, and plants that range from bladderworts up to mountain alders. And so each of these species has particular risks and threats, and there's some common themes that can be found throughout this list, which are addressed in large part by land conservation. That picture is actually not of a threat. That's just a really peaceful sort of little woodland glade there. So it's a nice contrast to the threat slide. But habitat loss is one of the major threats that our species in Massachusetts are at risk of, and that can take a lot of different forms. Habitat loss through development is obvious, right? As we convert lands over to development, we lose those habitats. But sometimes it's more subtle than that too. We can have changing habitats that are a result of human restricted activities. So when we think of beavers, for example, back pre-colonial times, beaver flowages, these big beaver ponds created amazing habitats which as the beavers flooded those areas, creates wetland habitats, and then as the beavers leave those areas, we see regeneration and creating of young forest and shrublands. And unfortunately, we've done a lot of building in our floodplains. We've built along stream sides, and we've disconnected the lateral connectivity between streams and floodplains. And so infrastructure prevents beavers from creating those big habitat disturbed areas. And so in some of those places, we see natural aging of forest lands, which in fact cuts down on habitat diversity because of those restrictions we've imposed on allowing natural processes to take place. The same kind of concept can be said about fire suppression and prevention, which has limited also some natural disturbance, especially in fire-dependent communities, which we have many in Massachusetts. And so that natural disturbance, again, creates situations where we have habitat loss, even where development hasn't taken place. I think perspective on fire and the role of fire in habitat management is really changing. I think we're seeing that nationwide and certainly in Massachusetts, which is a good thing. Climate change, of course, is a whole conversation and presentation on its own, which we can only scratch the surface on here, but that's a major threat to those species that I listed before. Invasive species, we've seen more and more invasive species, whether it's plant invasives or insect pests or threats to forests are speeding up. And of course, fragmentation is something that is a major concern of ours. As I said, we have a densely populated state. That means a lot of infrastructure, a lot of roads, and a lot of fragmentation. And speaking of fragmentation, we know from our research and existing literature that some of our kind of highly mobile species, like black bear, can have home ranges up to 300 square kilometers for a male bear. Our bobcat can be 75 or 80 square kilometers, and moose can be somewhere along the lines of 80 plus square kilometers. So these animals are covering a lot of distance, and fragmentation really matters. This figure you see here is some home ranges, local home ranges of black bears. Each of those dots are an individual female bear, which has a radio collar. And so you can see those are relatively small home ranges because our bear density is fairly high here in Berkshire County. But even here you see bears crossing the turnpike, coming along Route 20 and Route 7. And so there's opportunity for bears to be in developed areas and crossing roadways with a lot of consistency. And that's just our highly mobile species like bears. Is that fragmentation is much more perilous to some of our smaller, less mobile species, such as our salamanders. I do know that is a spring salamander, which has a little bit of a different life history, is not doing much road crossing, but some of these smaller species that fragmentation really has a more significant impact than it does on some of those species which can adapt a little bit better. So we know it's important to protect those habitats and provide all those habitats for those species that I listed. Let me give you a little bit of history on our land protection program and how it started. Our first land protection, in quotations, were public fishing leases that we took out back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So these were leases on private lands that were intended to allow people to fish a river or stream or lake and pond, that kind of thing. Right around 1949, we had our first lands acquired as what we called public shooting grounds. As you may have gotten from my earlier slide, we're an agency that regulates hunting and fishing and the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. And so that's our tradition. And so those early lands were called public shooting grounds. Really, they were just lands that were available for the public for hunting. And so we acquired more of those throughout the 1950s. And finally in the 60s, we got to our kind of modern approach to land holdings, which are our wildlife management areas, which is what we have today. A little more history, environmental bond bills, which are state funding for land conservation, kicked up in the 60s and then again in the late 80s, really expanded the program to allow us to acquire more land and protect more land for wildlife habitat. And in 1987, we got to the point where we were able to hire specific people, our land agents, which are spread across the state, which help us develop land projects and acquire properties for protection. In 1991, we instituted the wildland stamp, which is a $5 fee that is mandatory for anyone who buys a hunting and fishing license. They pay this $5, which goes directly towards land conservation. Anybody have a hunting and fishing license in the audience here? There's a few. Okay, good for you. Well, you're contributing importantly to our land conservation efforts. And so the funding for these protection efforts come from that wildland stamp and the environmental bond, like I mentioned, which is general state funds. We also have some federal funding that comes in periodically. We get reimbursed for some money spent on land protection from the federal government. We have grant programs that we sometimes will apply towards protection as well. And then gifts. The Berkshires has a lot of people who have held land for many generations, and oftentimes they want to see that land protected in perpetuity, not developed. And so we'll get properties given to us by people who want to see land in conservation. The form these lands take is wildlife management areas. So these are areas, and this is the bulk of our land protection program, areas that we want to keep in a wild state. So they're fully open to the public, but we don't develop trails or facilities at these places. We want to focus on wildlife habitat and wildlife dependent recreation. We also have conservation easements, or conservation restrictions, as they're sometimes called. This is a partnership with a land trust or a private landholder to allow the public to access those properties, make sure that they stay in a wild state or that they're protective of wildlife resources. We often pay for that easement to allow us to have those rights to keep those lands wild. Is another way we do that. So we have a lot of those scattered around the state as well. A few sanctuaries, those are lands that have different regulatory structure on them. There's only a handful of those throughout the state, and most of those came in a gift way. And then we have some access areas to allow people to access rivers and streams and places like that. So that's a little bit of a summary of why land protection is important and a little bit of history. But the really important part is, how do we know what to protect? We can't protect it all. We operate with limited dollars. And so we need to figure out what is important for us to target and think about when we want to talk about protecting biodiversity and wildlife in perpetuity. And so some of the things we prioritize: connectivity, building on existing lands, which helps address that issue of fragmentation that I talked about. Vulnerable or sensitive habitats, whether it's habitats that are vulnerable to climate loss or unusual habitats like calcareous fens, which we have in the Berkshires, a really important habitat type, or sandplain grasslands, which we have throughout the state. We focus a lot on those kind of unusual habitats. Public use is really important to us. Connecting people to land is really a really important factor when we look at whether we want to conserve a piece of property. We also, it's amazing how much data has changed, and our ability to interpret data has changed over the last, I'll say 20 years, but really it's changing so quickly. To be able to geospatially map data now is incredible, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a few minutes. But we try to be data driven. We try to focus on what the data tells us, what the most important areas are. We do have to be careful, I think, not to fall into the trap of being just focused on data, because there is certainly stuff we don't know. Massachusetts is, most of our woodlands and our protected areas are relatively small, but there's still plenty of information to gather there. So we have to be sure we ground truth these things and make sure we're doing the right thing. Our process, whenever we consider land for protection, we have a technical review team, which includes fisheries biologists and wildlife biologists, rare and endangered species biologists, people who are involved in the practical aspects of land acquisition, attorneys and things like that, and a lot of technical folks that have expertise in different categories review these properties to make sure that we're investing wisely. These are public dollars. These are dollars that come from people who buy hunting and fishing licenses and taxpayers, and so we want to make sure we're investing that money properly to get the best conservation we can for the dollar. How many of you have used Biomap? Has anybody looked at Biomap? There's a few. Oh, that's great. I would encourage any of you who haven't to take a look. This is a really wonderful tool that we use to help evaluate what are important lands and what are important habitats for us to protect. But it's all public facing. It's all readily usable by anybody who's interested in land conservation or just natural science in general. And the information is constantly being uploaded into Biomap to provide additional resources for anyone who's planning conservation. So it is just a quick, you'll see this if you go online, this is all available for you, but it's a really great tool to kind of prioritize actions. So if you get a chance to get on there and play around with that, it's really worth some time. And this is the kind of information you can get from Biomap. I mentioned one of the criteria we use for evaluating properties is connectivity. And so we can use this to determine if a property fills in a gap with our current land holdings. And connectivity goes beyond even the state borders and is really important as we face climate change, to have the ability for plants, animals to migrate northward or to higher elevation. Even slow-moving things like plants need that ability to move northward as climate impacts their existing habitats. So connectivity is a really important concept for us. And just to give you an example, Biomap, since 2009 to 2022, over 200,000 acres of land were protected in Massachusetts, and 62% of those were within the Biomap critical natural landscape. So as you look at, if you get a chance to look at Biomap and spend some time on there, you'll see that data and that guidance is really important and has worked really successfully. A couple of examples of climate vulnerable habitats that we have around here, these high elevation spruce fir swamps, like you see on the top there, and our high elevation cold water streams are really vulnerable habitats that we want to focus protection on. And I want to talk about the cold water streams a little bit because that's, well, one, I'm a fish biologist, so that's important to me. But I also think it's really important as we grow appreciation for the role that these waterways serve on our landscape. Does anybody recognize that fish by any chance? There you go. That is a slimy sculpin. Very good. That is a slimy sculpin, one of our coolest local fish, which I had to put the picture in there for you. So for many years, we've been monitoring our population of cold water fish and cold water streams. This is a graphic which shows all of the wild trout waters in Massachusetts. So these are all waters that have reproducing the native trout in them. You can see where the focus is. It's in the western part of the state. That's where the blue lines are. Those red lines are particularly high quality wild trout waters. And so land protection is a critical strategy for ensuring the viability of trout, sculpin, other cold water fish, because having those waterways protected protects water quality, water quantity, and these fish are vulnerable to thermal degradation because they have a low tolerance for warmer water. And so land conservation gives us that opportunity to protect those resources. And just a quick example of that, this is our Chalet Wildlife Management Area, which is right down the road in the town of Cheshire, mostly in Cheshire and Dalton. And you can see those blue lines on the map here are these headwater streams. Well, this is the headwaters of both the Hoosic and the Housatonic watershed. And so protecting this property here, which has these headwater streams on it, has much more impact than just the streams that are protected here, because what happens in these headwater streams dictates what's going on downstream. And so even though we've only protected maybe a handful of miles of actual cold water stream here, the impact is far beyond the map that you see here. So as I mentioned, we restore, protect, and manage land for wildlife. So ownership of land, any land requires, no matter what level of wild it is, requires some stewardship. So we try to keep our lands in a fairly wild state, but we still have responsibility of ownership. And it's really important to understand that biodiversity needs habitat diversity. And biodiversity is what we're about at Mass Wildlife in the state. And so we have active restoration and management activities that are designed to promote habitat diversity for many of the species in need. I showed you that list of 570 species. Well, some of those are specific to certain habitat types and communities. And so our restoration and management is intended to enhance those species. Practices such as prescribed fire. These are a couple of fires that we did here in Berkshire County. Restore fire-dependent communities that have, in some cases, been without fire for many, many years because fire has been suppressed. And I think we did somewhere around 1,000 acres of prescribed burns on wildlife management areas last year. Sometimes that's in partnership with private landowners or land trusts, but most of it is on our own wildlife management areas. So acquiring that land allows you to do this level of restoration. On restoring grasslands, another one of our management techniques to develop more climate-tolerant species, warm season grasses, which also sequester more carbon, is an important part of what we do on some of our lands. And then shrublands, which offer habitat for ground nesting birds and small mammals, and generally speaking, more habitat complexity means greater species richness. So having a wildlife management area like this one, which is right in Cheshire, Stafford Hill, provides all kinds of habitat complexity for a wide variety of species. And habitat restoration in aquatic systems, too, is part of our ownership responsibility. And we currently have a number of these projects underway right now. This is a dam removal on one of our wildlife conservation easements we did in cooperation with a local town. And this was the dam before and the dam after. And you can see that was a complete barrier to upstream and downstream movement of all kinds of organisms, not just fish, but all kinds of organisms. And so removing that restores that connectivity. One of the key components of our conservation mission is connecting people to nature. I think sometimes this aspect of conservation can be lost a little bit, especially when we're talking about preservation or wildlands. I really believe people invest in what they care about, and exposure to the natural world is critical for future conservationists. I think most people who are in the conservation field had experiences in nature, and that's what drives them into that field. And that's people, like I say, people invest in what they care about. So all of our lands are open to the public for passive recreation. So whether you enjoy hunting or fishing or birding or walking or paddling or meditating or whatever way you experience nature, the benefits to mental and physical health and social health are clear of being out in the outdoors. And so it really is, I think, a really key component to conservation, which we sometimes forget about the people part. So just to bring it back a little bit, I talked about our mission, and this is why land conservation is the cornerstone of what we do. I really believe it is probably the most important action we do as an agency that manages fish and wildlife resources. So where are we now? Right now in Massachusetts, about 27% of the state is protected. Depends on how you do that analysis. That could vary a little bit percentage-wise, but it's right around that number. For us at Mass Wildlife, we hold 230,000 acres statewide now. And this figure on the right, which seems like a mishmash of different colors, that's a publicly available open space layer. So all those different colors indicate different levels of conservation or different ownership by different conservation organizations. If you have a chance to, if you haven't spent much time looking at GIS and the public-facing GIS, the Mass Mapper application, it is really easy to use, and the amount of data on there is incredible now. So even if you just want to take a look at where all the trails are, or you want to look at the geology of an area or the land ownership, all of that is publicly available and really interesting to play around with. So I'd encourage you to do that. But what we're working towards is continuing to build that connectivity that I talked about, try to boost these numbers for land protection. And what's next for us? So the Department of Fish and Game just recently released our 5-year strategic plan. Our goal is to conserve key landscapes and double the pace of land protection in the next 5 years. So we've made a full commitment that we intend to continue to ramp up our land protection to protect wildlife resources. We want to restore habitats and connectivity, and we're focused on carbon sequestration and decarbonization of some of our facilities, providing equitable access to nature, and increasing food security, because our food is very much connected to the landscape, and that includes our wildlands too. That's just a part of that strategic plan. There's actually real concrete goals. If you have a chance to look at that, you can see exactly what we intend to do over the next 5 years. And then we also, the Healy administration has recently signed a biodiversity executive order, which tasks us with reviewing existing biodiversity conservation efforts and establishing clear nature positive goals for Massachusetts for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So there's a lot happening in Massachusetts on the land conservation side of things and the biodiversity side of things. And so I feel pretty good about where we're going, and especially out here in the Berkshires, where I think we're going to focus a lot of our conservation efforts. At least I hope so. And that's what I have for you. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about this topic or any other. Yes.
How much coordination do you have with the surrounding areas, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York?
Really good question about connection to the other states. Not enough, I would say, is the short answer. You know, if you look at the Massachusetts-New York state line, for example, that's a huge section of conservation land on both sides of the state line. And so we did some coordinating with New York on that, and we follow what they do because that you really do need to look beyond the state boundaries when you're thinking about range-wide impacts to different species and bigger conservation efforts. We have some connection and worked on some projects in the kind of northern forest biome, which is most of the northern part of New England and part of New York, and so we've worked with our sister states on that. But I would say that there is definitely more that could be done there. It's hard with state government. You know, we get focused on our own boundaries and funding sources and things, but we try to reach across state lines when we can. Yeah.
What are some of the challenges you overcome when trying to succeed in a goal?
Well, for us, if the goal, you know, which we're talking about here is land conservation, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Dollars is a big part of it. I mean, the actual funding. We always have more opportunity for protection than we have funding for. And so we have to make tough choices sometimes. That's why the science is so important for us to figure out what is important to protect. But if we had unlimited dollars and support that goes along with that, then we could do more. I would say that's the biggest obstacle for us. Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on stocking non-native trout and their effect on native aquatic species.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, as with any of those kind of questions, there's a lot of site-specific components to it. So stocking of trout really provides an important recreational opportunity, and especially when it's in places that wouldn't otherwise exist. And it's really important for connecting people to our aquatic resources to get people to care, you know, and invest in those. There's a lot of literature that generally stocking fish on native populations globally has certainly caused harm, but it really does depend on the specific spot and whether you have, you know, competition or genetic impacts, genetic introgression or not. So it really depends on the spot. We stock currently. You saw my map of all the wild trout, maybe resources that I showed. You know, the state of Massachusetts has something like 1,300 wild trout waters in Massachusetts. We don't stock very many of them. There's less than 10% of those that we put fish in. And so we're very focused on continuing to enhance our wild trout populations and protect those. We work on that every day, protecting those resources. But stocking does fill a really important role, both for recreational fishermen, for, in some cases, direct food source, and really important connecting people to be able to have that opportunity where they wouldn't otherwise. Wild trout very much a priority for us, and so we're constantly making changes along those lines. Yeah.
What's your favorite part about working in the Fish and Game Agency in Massachusetts?
That's a good question. Like most important stuff, it really, I think, is this land protection stuff. You know, favorite stuff. I mean, I did have 2 bear cubs today that I was working with. That was pretty awesome. So some of the actual direct wildlife work that we do is pretty exciting. Go ahead. Yep.
Let's see. Is mass wildlife vulnerable at this moment due to stuff happening in the federal government?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure we fully know at this point. You know, our funding comes from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses primarily, and then reimbursement from the federal government for taxes on hunting and fishing equipment and things like that. So I I guess I don't know the answer to that. I would say this, that we certainly haven't been as directly impacted as some of our colleagues in the federal government who are in the conservation business at this time. Yeah.
You suggested that the role and view of fire is changing. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I think the concept of fire as habitat management is much more accepted than it was even, let's say 10 years ago, but even over the last few years. Because we have such an active prescribed fire program now where we apply fire in these fire-dependent communities, it's much more accepted than I think it was in the past. I would also say the idea of a wildfire, and not needing to necessarily be immediately controlled if the habitat doesn't require it, if it's not protecting infrastructure or other things, is more acceptable now than in the past. And even those significant wildfires, which are a serious situation, there are ecological benefits that come along with those after the fact. And I think we've seen across the country the significance and the severity of those fires, and some of that preventative, regular kind of fire impacts might help with those situations. So I guess that's, yeah.
Do you distinguish between forest and brush fires in your agency?
Well, we're not the response for wildfires. That's the Department of Conservation and Recreation. DCR is the Fire Management Bureau. So our real role when it comes to fire is in providing and producing habitat. So we manage prescribed fire for that purpose. So a little different than the kind of brush and wildfire that our sister agency responds to. I think you had a question.
So, just as a resident of rural Berkshire County, is there any kind of partnerships or ways that the population generally can help you contribute to your objectives, meet your goals, etc.? Is there any ways we can get involved?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say the easiest way you as an individual would be to work with some of your land trusts, whether it's a local town land trust or a regional land trust, because they're doing a lot of good conservation work in partnership with us. A lot of our projects come about because some neighbor has brought up the fact that conservation is an option to another neighbor, right? And people we've worked with in the past have suggested, oh, you might want to put your land in conservation and you should talk to Mass Wildlife about that. So that word of mouth really matters. It's a little harder for a regular, everyday person to get involved with the state government. We're just the way it's structured, it's a little bit harder. So I guess I would direct you probably towards some of those partner organizations like local land trusts or regional land trusts who we work with all the time. Yeah.
What's Mass Wildlife's protocol for the possible return of a cat hunt or a wolf? An individual, not so much like an entire reintroduction or population move, but.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we don't have an established plan for those. As you maybe know, we get a lot of calls on those kind of issues all the time. We're glad to come out and take a look. And as it turns out, most of those are not the case. It's the sightings are wrong, or there's a photo that was incorrect, that kind of thing. But so we don't really have a strategy or plan for those because it's so far away. I mean, there's not really a reproducing population of mountain lions anywhere nearby. And so could you have a rogue individual? Sure. I mean, that's happened. Really unusual. But that has happened. So it's not really, it's just not really on the radar in terms of management at this time until it becomes something that's more real and more imminent, I guess I would say.
So relatedly, we had a talk recently about looking at, in the Adirondacks in New York, facilitating sort of the natural spread of wolves back into that area. And they were talking about particularly the need to update hunting regulations around coyotes because many states, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Massachusetts, allow, especially like hunting at night where it's very hard to distinguish a coyote from a wolf. Have those conversations come through? Is there thought in Massachusetts about distinguishing wolves and coyotes and updating hunting regulations?
No, not specifically for that. I mean, we review our hunting regulations periodically, and Massachusetts is, we have a coyote hunting season in Massachusetts, but we do manage them as a resource, which is why we have a time period season and a number of other components to those regulations on what you can and can't do. As some states view them differently. Some states just have open seasons on coyotes, as maybe you know from the talk. But no, it's not really an issue at this time. I mean, ultimately, if those efforts take off in New York or closer by, then that is something we'll have to talk about and consider. But it's just not on the high priority list at this time. Yes.
I saw in one of your photographs, I believe you made reference to removal of trees, large trees. Is this for lumbering purposes or some other reason, and what would those reasons be?
Yeah, I don't know if specifically which one I showed, maybe in one of the slides there. For all of that kind of active habitat management, whether it's trees or prescribed fire or other things, are all designed for wildlife habitat. So yeah, in some circumstances where we have a plantation of something that is inappropriate, or we have trees that are diseased or dead, and the habitat calls for it, we create some young forest habitat at times, if the area calls for it, if it's part of the plan for a wildlife management area to create that habitat. So that might have been what I showed on there is creating some of that young forest habitat.
Is that better for carbon sequestration to have a young habitat like that?
It's better to have, it depends on how you look at it. It's a complicated question. It's better for biodiversity to have a variety of habitats, certainly. Depends on what the use of the timber is, right? If that gets used, then it's still sequestering carbon, even if it's used in building, for example. And then you still have more carbon sequestration as the forest grows. So it's kind of a mixed answer, I guess. It really, again, site specific. I don't want to really generalize on that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. But let me put it this way, any of our habitat management activities that we do now are certainly looked at by us and by others under the glass of carbon, and because it's important to us. Yeah.
You have a great image on the screen. What would you have us notice about this image?
I just really, I like that rock wall. This is that's a spot in Hancock, and it's up on the hilltop of Misery Mountain, and just a beautiful piece of woods with that rock wall there and that big old cherry, it looks like.
And from the Fish and Wildlife perspective, what can we expect here?
We can expect that to stay exactly the way it is. That's a piece of property that will stay in that wild state, and I don't anticipate, because it's pretty, I don't know if you've ever been up to the top of Misery Mountain, but it's quite steep and doesn't get a lot of visitation, so it really is one of those areas that you would go to and you would say is one of the wilder areas in Massachusetts. Yes?
Mass Wildlife have a position on the controversy in North Adams on the Bellows Pike Trail when the city and Matt Audubon wanted to take out some of the plantation pipelines?
I don't think so. No, for me personally, the answer is no. I don't know if there was any involvement from our technical staff, our technical forestry staff, or not. But I don't believe so, because that's, yeah. I think the answer is no. Yes.
Is anything being done to, I don't know, are there any innovations or progress being made on the issue of roadkill? That's been a frustration for a very long time. It's like we can invent, there's all these other inventions and technologies that can do crazy stuff, but it just seems like roadkill is just getting worse and worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's actually a fair amount of work on that. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of the work done by TNC and UMass to focus on where some of those key crossings are. And our colleagues at the Department of Transportation, now some of which we've worked with for a long time, have really focused on some of those crossings and finding a way to solve those problems. So some of that is connecting these lands, right, to make sure that we have conservation lands in close. But some of it is actual physical crossings at some of these roadways. And, you know, we're going to have, and I think it's going to rain tonight, right? It's going to be pretty warm out. We're going to have salamanders and amphibians crossing roads here any day now. And we see a lot of mortality on there. And so there's been some work on that, creating tunnels for amphibians, and I think there's a pretty good push on starting to build crossings that are wildlife friendly, big open culvert crossings, and they get used, they do. So yes, I think there's a fair amount of work on that actually, and I you know, there's a lot of roads in Massachusetts, but there are some key spots that could make a real difference. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it.